The Complete Roman Army was something of a break from the other books I've been writing up until then. It's a little bit like Roman Warfare in that essentially it's a glossy, well-illustrated, coffee table type book. Though hopefully, even more than Roman Warfare, it's quite serious and it's quite detailed. It was written in what was called, and is still called, magazine format, where every page is planned out and there are what they call text boxes dealing with other topics set into the page. The captions for the illustrations are long and detailed. It took a lot of work in the production of this, and I think Thames and Hudson did a terrific job. It's a really nice looking book. I think the length of 60,000 words, again, you're always frustrated as an author. You'd always like a little bit more, particularly if you're an author like me, and whether that's the bit of Welsh blood in the family or just my tendency, a little bit on the long-winded side. You know, I like to go into detail where I can. I remember telling students the last time I was teaching that I don't think I could write an undergraduate essay now because I couldn't compress things down into a few pages. I'd have to say, well, actually, I don't think that's the right question, or can't we consider this evidence, or look at the broader context. So that meant I had to be very disciplined in a way I wasn't used to. So it was a good training in that respect, and it was quite hard to do, but I'm proud of the end result. It concentrates very much on the army as an institution, soldiers' lives, soldiers' experiences, to some extent equipment, though there are other books that are probably more detailed on the purely equipment level of things, and how that army developed. So it's almost like a companion to Roman Warfare. Roman Warfare will tell you the story, will tell you about the big wars, something of what they're like. The Complete Roman Army will tell you more about what the army was at that stage, who Roman soldiers were, who their officers were, why they served, what they got from it, their conditions, their lives, their expectations. That did mean that inevitably it was tended to be drawn towards the period where the sources for that sort of thing are far greater. The introductory section looks at the early Roman army and looks at the army of the Punic Wars and the initial conquest in the 2nd century BC as the Romans expand around the Mediterranean and beyond, a little bit about the army of Caesar's day. But there's a big problem with that period that there isn't really a Roman army as such. There are armies raised by the Roman Republic to go off and do various jobs. They're armies of citizens who come forward voluntarily. It's part of their obligation to the state. They're paid, but not at a high rate. You know, the standard daily pay for a Roman soldier doesn't go up for centuries until Julius Caesar doubles it at some point in his career. We're not quite sure when he does that, whether it's Gaul or later on during the Civil War. So this is an army that exists for a while. It goes off, fights campaigns, and since the book was written, more and more evidence is turning up from Spain of some of the battlefields from that era, some of the siege sites from that era, and a few Roman camps associated with it. But really, when you think about the sheer scale of conflict of the Punic Wars, of the wars with the Macedonians, with the Seleucids, the conquests elsewhere, there is very little archaeological imprint of the army of that period. And it certainly didn't set up a lot of inscriptions. These are Roman citizens. They're serving as soldiers because that's what Roman citizens do when the state requires it. But they're doing it as a citizen. When they die, they don't commemorate themselves as former soldier of this legion or former centurion, because your neighbours would know all of that and they just expect it of you as a fellow Roman. You're commemorated simply as a family member, as a member of a voting tribe, as a farmer, as a local magistrate, whatever it might be. So you don't have a separate existence. There isn't an army separate from the Roman state. Roman armies in this period are very much the Roman people under arms, and that means it's harder to study them and get a sense of them. That changes during the course of the 1st century BC, but particularly after the establishment of the rule of emperors, the Principate, the rule of one as we call it under Caesar Augustus, and you create this professional army. And the bulk of the book is really on how that professional army, the army of the 1st, 2nd, and say first half of the 3rd century, functioned. And then you have a whole range of different evidence. You don't have as many good literary accounts of battles and campaigns as you do from earlier. You have some, but they're nowhere near as frequent or as detailed. You know, Josephus' Jewish War is really the only account of the army of the Principate at a level of detail that's equivalent to, say, Caesar's commentaries. And it doesn't quite match those, but in terms of the siege warfare it describes, it comes very close, though Josephus was writing from a different perspective, And this was a war that didn't involve big pitched battles, so we don't get to see the army doing that sort of thing. But on the other hand, the archaeological evidence just explodes. There are huge amounts of bases, whether permanent fortresses and forts that were set up and occupied for generations, sometimes for centuries, or temporary camps, marching camps, perhaps only occupied for a night or for a very short period on campaign. You've got outposts, you've got works like aqueducts and roads that were built by the army, you've got frontier systems like Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall, the limites in other areas. You've got tile stamps with unit insignia on. Roman army units stay in existence for a very long time in this period, particularly the legions, but also many auxiliary units, and they tend to like putting their name up on things they've done. So when they've made tiles, you get stamps with their symbol and their name on. You get building inscriptions when they've completed work on a camp or some other project. Is there telling you who they are. You get altars dedicated. And when soldiers die after their long 25 years of service, they often commemorate themselves as soldiers, as a veteran of this legion or this cohort. You have, for a substantial period, the diplomata, the bronze copies of documents granting citizenship to former auxiliary soldiers when they've been honourably discharged after their 25 years of service, and now they become a Roman citizen. They get a copy of the document that is in the archives back in Rome itself. You get centurions setting up career inscriptions saying, I served in this legion, that legion, boasting that they've built something. Even to the extent where on Hadrian's Wall you get these little inscriptions that tell you that the century of so-and-so built this, or the cohort of number such and such did this stretch of wall. Far more information. You learn about their religion from the altars they set up, some of their beliefs and attitudes, their symbols from the tombstones they set up. That might record details of family members, this sort of thing. And then on top of that, you have the subliterary sources, the papyri, particularly from Egypt, the writing tablets from places like Vindolanda, Carlisle and elsewhere, that record day-to-day details of army administration, of soldiers' lives, of purchases. Far more information, because the army has become very much a distinct part of society. And you can argue about how separate it is or not altogether from the wider Roman population, but it certainly has its own way of doing things, and some things that these men do in their lives are completely separate because it's the sort of thing only soldiers do. So it's a story of the army sometimes fighting and how it operated. It's the story of the army occupying frontiers, but it's also the story of daily life. It's when we can talk about what sort of food they ate, when we can talk about conditions in barrack blocks, the size of rooms even, the differences between officers like centurions and other soldiers in terms of accommodation, pay, luxuries, all of these things, all the little details that make the army very human and seem very modern in certain respects, though again we have to be cautious about simply just assuming any regular army is just like any other regular army. There are aspects where it is, but it's also a product of the society and the times that produce it. So there's a lot on that. There's less than I would like on the later Roman army. Again, this is largely to do with evidence. There are all sorts of problems in understanding the detail because by the 4th century there are fewer and fewer inscriptions set up by soldiers. The army's not building so many bases, the ones they are building are much smaller. A lot of troops are being billeted and garrisoned in towns and cities. Now that's probably always been true, particularly in some provinces, but it's more common now, and there's just less trace of all those types of evidence that give us so much detail about the Roman army of the 1st, 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD decline and eventually vanish. So although I can look a little bit at the changes, and we've got quite good information for weaponry and equipment and that sort of thing, so there are some aspects we can do, and we get some literary sources like Ammianus Marcellinus in the 4th century is wonderful in some of the little details he gives that we don't always get elsewhere. So I did my best. I would have liked the book to be about 10,000 words longer, and I probably would have put more in on the later Roman army than there was space to do, but I thought it was best to give priority to the era where we do know more about it, try and cover that in a lot of detail. And again, there are good books on the equipment that will supplement it. Peter Connolly's stuff, although old now, is still well worth a look. You've got some of Graham Sumner's illustrations, you've got Simon James, you've got Bishop and Coulston if you want real detail on Roman military equipment, and some of the other stuff coming out, and of course in other languages as well. There's obviously very good German scholarship on the Roman army in general and Roman military archaeology in particular. So this is a book trying to bring together some of that and summarize it. And hopefully I think it does that job. It's now getting on for 18 years old. And although there have been some new discoveries since then, the bulk of the book, 95+% of it, still stands as pretty much the consensus of opinion, influenced by my views, of course, that we had then and we still have now. So I think it's still does what it's meant to do. It's an introduction to the Roman army. It's a reference work. It's simple, and if you want lots and lots more detail, you'll need to go on and again follow the reading list there and other more recent books on the subject. But I tried to pack as much into it as I could, and I think it gives you a good idea for whether you're just have a casual interest in the Roman army or even slightly more detailed one. Gives you a good starting place. This is some idea of what it was like.